Mike retired at 68 with $340,000 in his portfolio, still sitting in roughly 90% stocks, the same allocation that had served him well for 30 years of saving. 8 months into retirement, the market dropped hard, and Mike watched a number he'd spent 3 decades building shrink faster than he ever imagined possible. The mistake wasn't being in stocks. The mistake was still being that heavily in stocks the moment he started pulling money out. And that single detail changed everything about how long his savings would actually last. Here's what actually happened to Mike's money, why the timing mattered more than the amount, and what a different allocation could have meant for the same $340,000. For most of Mike's working life, being heavily invested in stocks was exactly the right call. When you're contributing every month and you're 20 or 30 years from needing the money, a market downturn is actually an opportunity. You keep buying shares at a discount, and history shows the market has always recovered given enough time. That's the entire logic behind staying aggressive while you're accumulating. The problem is that logic quietly flips the moment you stop contributing and start withdrawing, and a lot of retirees never adjust for that shift. This is called sequence of returns risk, and it's one of the most misunderstood risks in retirement planning, because it's not about your average return over time. It's about the order those returns happen in. A portfolio that averages 7% a year over 20 years can end up in wildly different places depending on whether the bad years hit at the beginning of retirement or the end. If the crash happens early, while you're also withdrawing money to live on, you're selling shares at depressed prices just to generate income, which permanently shrinks the base that has to recover later. If that same crash happens in year 18 instead of year 1, the portfolio's had almost 2 decades to grow first, and the damage is far less severe. Let's put Mike's actual numbers on this. Assume Mike planned to withdraw a fairly standard 4% in his first year of retirement, about $13,600 from his $340,000 balance, with that dollar amount adjusted upward slightly each year for inflation, which for this hypothetical example we'll assume runs around 3%. 8 months in, the market drops a hypothetical 35%, which is a realistic, if painful, illustration of what a serious downturn can look like, comparable in scale to some of the sharper corrections markets have seen historically. With 90% of his money in stocks, Mike's $340,000 doesn't just dip. It falls to roughly $221,000. Here's where it gets worse than it looks at first glance. Mike still needs that same $13,600 to live on, but now he's pulling it from a $221,000 base instead of $340,000, which means his effective withdrawal rate has jumped from a sustainable 4% to more than 6% overnight, without Mike doing anything differently at all. Under a hypothetical continued average return of around 6% annually after the crash, and continuing withdrawals adjusted for inflation, a portfolio starting this deep in the hole and pulling out this high a percentage runs a real risk of being fully depleted somewhere around Mike's mid-80s, noticeably short of what a 68-year-old today might reasonably plan for, especially with life expectancies climbing well past 85 for a large share of retirees. Now here's the comparison that actually matters, because the crash itself wasn't the mistake. Plenty of retirees experience a market downturn and are fine. The difference is allocation. Picture a second version of Mike, same $340,000, same retirement date, same 4% starting withdrawal, but this Mike shifted to something closer to a 60% stock, 40% bond allocation in the 5 years leading up to retirement, using a gradual glide path instead of staying at 90% stocks until the day he stopped working. When the identical 35% market drop hits, this more balanced portfolio doesn't fall anywhere near as far, because 40% of it is sitting in bonds that weren't part of the equity sell-off. Instead of losing over $100,000, this portfolio drops to roughly $289,000. A meaningful decline, but nowhere near the damage Mike's version absorbed. His effective withdrawal rate ticks up modestly to somewhere around 4.7% instead of jumping past 6%. Under the same hypothetical 6% average return going forward, this portfolio has a realistic shot at lasting into Mike's mid to late 90s. Roughly a decade longer than the 90% stock version. From the exact same starting balance, the exact same withdrawal plan, and the exact same crash. That's the entire lesson in one comparison. Same $340,000, same market event, same spending. And depending on one allocation decision made years before the crash even happened, the difference is roughly a decade of retirement income. It's worth pausing here, because this isn't an argument for abandoning stocks in retirement. That would be its own mistake in the other direction. Being too conservative, too early, means missing out on growth you'll likely need over a retirement that could easily last 25 or 30 years, and inflation alone can quietly erode a portfolio that's parked entirely in cash or bonds. The goal isn't zero risk. It's making sure the portion of your portfolio you'll need in the next several years isn't sitting somewhere it could get cut in half right when you need to start drawing from it. There are a few practical ways retirees manage this. Some build what's sometimes called a bucket strategy, keeping 1 to 3 years of expected withdrawals in cash or short-term bonds, so a market drop doesn't force them to sell stocks at a loss just to pay the bills that year. Others use a glide path, gradually reducing stock allocation in the 5 to 10 years before retirement, the way our second version of Mike did. And some simply revisit their allocation with a financial advisor as retirement approaches, rather than leaving a decades-old allocation untouched out of habit. Of course, every one of these numbers is a hypothetical illustration, not a guarantee. Real markets don't move in a straight line, and a 35% drop, a 6% recovery rate, and 3% inflation are simplified assumptions used to make the math easy to follow. Your own portfolio, your own withdrawal needs, and your own risk tolerance will look different. Tax treatment on withdrawals, account type, and Social Security timing all factor into the real picture too, and none of those are captured in this simplified comparison. So here's a practical 3-step plan if you're anywhere near this stage. First, know your actual current allocation. Not what you remember setting it 2 years ago, but what it's grown into today. Since strong stock returns over time can quietly push your stock percentage higher than you realize without you touching a thing. Second, think specifically about the money you'll need in the next 3 to 5 years of retirement, and consider whether that portion should be somewhere more stable than the rest of your portfolio. Third, if you're within 5 to 10 years of retiring, this is worth a real conversation with a financial advisor about a glide path, not a decision to make alone based on a rule of thumb you read once. Mike's version of this story didn't happen because he made a bad investment. Every fund he owned did exactly what it was supposed to do. The mistake was timing, carrying an accumulation phase allocation into the exact years when a downturn does the most damage. And that's a mistake that's entirely avoidable, years before the market ever gives you a reason to worry. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial, tax, or legal advice. The scenarios, percentages, and dollar figures shown are hypothetical and based on the assumptions explained in this video. Actual market returns, withdrawal needs, and outcomes will be different for your situation, and past performance never guarantees future results. Always consult a qualified financial advisor before making decisions about your retirement portfolio allocation. If you're not sure what your own stock allocation actually looks like right now, that's worth checking today, not after the next downturn. Subscribe to Mike's Money Adventures for more real retirement stories like this one, and let me know in the comments, what's the biggest retirement question keeping you up at night? If portfolio withdrawals are on your mind, the video on withdrawal order between your 401k, Roth, and taxable accounts is a natural next step.